This August, we will be hosting philosopher Dylan Shaul, whose work orbits both the study of German idealism and the philosophy of religion. This month will function as an invitation to rethinking metaphysics, with ancient, modern, and postmodern philosophy. To get involved during our live sessions this August, or to access the recordings indefinitely, sign up below. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Dylan Shaul. Dylan is a friend of the channel now. We did a conversation a few months ago titled Return to Plato, and Dylan is an assistant professor from the Department of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. He specializes in 18th and 19th century philosophy, especially German idealism and Jewish philosophy. And in our original conversation on the return to Plato, we were kind of tracking his interest in Derrida and the way in which, and also structuralism, post-structuralism in general, and the way in which that then transitioned into conversations about and work he's done on German idealism, as well as classical Platonic philosophy. And that sort of thread of thoughts became kind of a point of interest for both of us that we thought deserved an entire month at the portal. So this August, Dylan will be coming for 4 sessions at the portal for a month dedicated to the philosophy of theology. We could even say that the meta theme for the month is Metaphysics Resurrected. And in this conversation, we're going to perhaps precisely get into that topic. What do we mean by metaphysics resurrected? And of course, we could tie that into, if you've been following Philosophy Portal's work, we could tie that into the Christian atheism course. We could tie that into the idea of death of God theology. Of course, metaphysics resurrected here, metaphysics could be a stand-in for the notion of God, but we'll get into the weeds of all of this, not only in this conversation, but in this August at the portal. So, Dylan, welcome back to the channel. Anything you want to sort of say as an opening about what we've talked about previously and how that thread maybe connects to our theme for August?
Well, thanks so much for having me. Good to be back at the portal. Yes, I mean, we can have a lot to say. There's a lot to say about metaphysics and philosophy and theology and all the rest. I don't know where we should start exactly, but I mean, go ahead.
Maybe let's just say like I think that there was a thread of thought in the 20th century philosophy, and here maybe pointing towards mix of structuralism and post-structuralism. Derrida is certainly in the mix, where there might have been the idea that metaphysics was dead. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so I guess in a way the big narrative that I want to offer, the grand narrative, so far as those are supposedly dead as well, according to the 20th century post-structurals. But metaphysics, right, from Plato, or if you go back a little bit further to Thales and the pre-Socratics, to or through ancient philosophy, medieval scholasticism, modern rationalism, a certain through line in which pure reason can come to know the absolute, the eternal, the divine, God, also the soul, and the world. Those are the 3 traditional objects of special metaphysics, or metaphysical specialis we can talk about. But from Kant onward through the 19th, 20th century, in both the so-called, analytic or Anglo-American side of philosophy and also the so-called continental French-German traditions, there's similar critique of metaphysics, abandonment of metaphysics that gets intensified as the decades roll on, until such time as you said rightly, sort of the death of metaphysics, the death of God, the death of man as well, the end of all these things, the end of the world, and so on and so forth. But I think, or what I'd like to propose, is that we've sort of exhausted that field, as much as those critics of metaphysics said that metaphysics was exhausted, had come to its end. I say the end of metaphysics has come to its end. And so now we need, or what follows from that is, of course, the return, a new beginning of the metaphysical tradition, which would be rehabilitating, resurrecting a certain, again, line of thought that runs from Plato to Leibniz, but in a way that I think also has to take into account the justified criticisms, such as they are, of that tradition within the 19th, 20th century. Yes, that's sort of the idea in a nutshell.
So for me, the way I've been thinking, and this is framed in Real Speculations, which is a book I published last month, is this thread of thought and philosophy that kind of begins and ends with Kant. Like Kant as this super critical thinker of, even in the Christian atheism course, I kind of framed him as perhaps the unconscious beginning of death of God theology in a way, at least death of God theology as it appears internal to philosophy, and with death of God here representing the metaphysical project as you outlined. What is it about the Kantian criticism, in your view, that was so cutting and so historically transformative? And does it reflect not just sort of a change in philosophy, but also a change in society?
Yes. So, right, I should say, of course, there's always been critics of the metaphysical tradition within the history of Western philosophy. So, I think in the ancient world, you have, of course, the sophists, who Plato was always arguing with, contending with, as well as sort of the materialists, the atomists, whether Democritus, the Epicureans, whoever it was. You know, in the medieval period, you have the nominalists as well, like Occam, who rejected, let's say, the proofs of God's existence as part of rational theology, as part of the cornerstone of metaphysics. And then in the modern period, of course, you have, there's the skeptics throughout. You have the empiricists. I mean, Hume is sort of the most radical empiricist skeptic, again, criticizing the metaphysical pretensions to knowledge of the soul, freedom, the world, and God, and so on. But then, so what's special about
Why
Kant?
is Kant so
If
special?
anything is, I think the way I've been saying it in my own mind recently is that Kant is the first to argue against metaphysics in the name of pure reason itself. In the name of pure reason itself. So that is to say, the empiricists were not proponents of pure reason. They said, well, pure reason doesn't give us knowledge. Why? Because empirical perception does, sensation, which in fact is just the position of the sophists, as Plato describes in the Theaetetus, that the idea that all knowledge is aesthesis, or perception. And he says, well, and that's the same as what Protagoras says when he says man is the measure of all things, is that each man deems to be true what he perceives to be true, but there's no ultimate measure or ultimate truth. Of course, Plato's alternative is that God is the measure of all things. But that same thread runs through, right, all the way to Hume, let's say. But Kant believes that pure reason is, judge, jury, and executioner of itself. There's no higher court than pure reason. So he refuses the sophistical or empiricist view that perception is the ultimate arbiter of truth. But he's, in a way, he uses this phrase to describe someone else's view, but I think it applies to his as well. It's the euthanasia of pure reason, as he supposed. So pure reason destroys itself in his own thinking. And as Heine said about Kant, he killed God, as you had mentioned, with the death of God theology. Robespierre, who killed a king, but what is that to killing God? And that, I think, just in terms of the other thing you mentioned, the historical moment of Kant's philosophical revolution is also a revolutionary period in human society. I mean, it's the right smack between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And, Heine there, of course, bringing together the French Revolution, the Kantian Copernican Revolution, as he described his own innovations. And Hegel also is a great thinker of this conjunction, the fact that the French Revolution, which sought to sort of remake the world through the affordances of the human mind to slough away all historical determinations that began from absolute freedom. In a way, the Kantian system is an attempt to do that at the philosophical level with differences. I mean, Hegel thinks it's the sublation of the French Revolution, I suppose. But that's the time in which we still live, I take it. We're living in the wake of those political revolutions, and we're living in the wake of the Kantian philosophical revolution, neither of which have gone particularly well, I guess is the point. I'm trying to. Well, they have things to offer. Yes, what I say it's not a mere return to what was before, an abstract return, but also not just simply continuing along the way we're going, both at the level of history and the level of thinking.
I think that there it's kind of important to emphasize that there is a very strange alliance and unity between metaphysics as a metaphor for social order. And maybe there is some sort of deeper overlap here between what Kant is offering and what Kant is offering as a philosophical project and sort of the changes and the transformations of the social order of his day, like the American and the French Revolution. You mentioned, what is killing a monarch in relationship to killing God. There's also a way in which the monarch was sort of having rationally justified his social position by the metaphysics of God. So there is this, again, this intimate link. I mean, at the moment at Philosophy Portal, we're currently in the middle of studying Marx's critique of the philosophy of right, and a lot of what he's trying to do in that text is kind of delegitimize the whole notion of a monarch. And that's, you could see that as definitely an atheistic move that's very much in this post-Kantian death of God theology kind of opening. So yeah, now we're kind of wrestling with, people are using things like post-liberal society. There are people calling for monarchy in certain instances. I'm thinking here of someone like a Curtis Yarvin, but there is a yearning for the pre-modern, let's say, here with modern being a signifier associated with the American and French revolutions and perhaps Kantian philosophy. So with that mix, what do you think's at work here with the yearning for the pre-modern, so to speak?
Yes. So, I mean, perhaps I should have begun this way. Now I'm thinking retrospectively, and this is what I ought to have said when you invited me to speak at the beginning. That, well, metaphysics, I think, in general, as Aristotle defines it in the Metaphysics, is the science of first causes. Okay, so what's a first cause? Well, a cause is any reason or explanation for some caused thing. So here we are. We exist in a world of conditioned or caused beings, and we want to ask, well, why? Why are things as they are? And we can do that, so I would submit, both backwards and forwards. That is, we could take things as they are in the world and ask, well, what caused them? What brought them into being? Why? Backwards and backwards until you reach some first cause, some primary being that, I think, in order to be such a first cause, must be the cause of itself, and therefore the cause of everything else that comes from it. Call that the first principle or arche of all things, or the beginning of all things. But you could also ask why going forwards, and this is coming to the political side of things, the ethical political side of things. You ask going forward, say, for the sake of what are all the things that are as they are? And you ask why, until, again, in sort of a mirror image of the backwards question, you reach some final end of all things, which is an end in itself, in a way that then makes everything else a means towards that end. And I think in both cases, the only possible candidate for the first cause and the final end of all things is God, or choose whatever name you'd like for it. But in the Platonic tradition, we call it the good, right? It's both the good that gives rise to all the beings of the world, and it's also the good that is the end towards which all things are striving. But now the good is, right, an ethical, political ideal. In at least the Platonic Aristotelian tradition, I claim the whole metaphysical tradition from Plato to Leibniz. And so politics is about the pursuit of the good life for the collective of human beings, right? Now that's at
Is
least as
that specifically Aristotelian politics?
well, Platonic Aristotelian. I mean,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think of Aristotle is basically just a Platonist, a sort of somewhat off the rails kind of Platonist, but he's he learned everything from Plato, and then the Neoplatonists who sort of synthesize Plato and Aristotle, in effect, with a slight privileging to Plato. So he comes out on top because, I mean, for among other reasons, because Plato has the idea of the good, which Aristotle rejects, that there's a single form of the good, right? Although he does put God, Aristotle still puts God as the final telos of all things that moves everything through
And the
love.
first cause, right? The prime mover.
Yes, yes, exactly. So uh, that's right. So, well, there's two
We've,
things. I
we've
mean,
got the
one of them
first
is
cause, we've got the final cause, we've got the Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists, and this whole metaphysical system here.
yes. So I meant to bring it back to the question of liberalism, monarchy, all of these things, because often a way that at least liberal political philosophers who I speak to might put their view is that um, liberalism doesn't endorse any particular vision of the good life. It doesn't think of what politics is about is pursuing the good. Rather, it's to create a sort of a neutral, procedural, or formal space in which each individual or group of individuals can pursue privately their own conception of the good life, but to do so with freedom and non-interference from the state or from other human beings. Now, I think Plato and Aristotle might be worried about that because it's almost like a nihilistic politics in some way. It's to say we don't have a vision of the good that we're pursuing. Each of you gets to do whatever they think is good. I mean, and each man is the measure of all things for himself, as the sophistical position was. But we, the political collective, don't endorse any particular conception of good. Now, I mean, it's a bit of bad faith, isn't it? Because in a way, they do have a vision of the good life, even if they refuse to call it that. I mean, it's free market competition and democratic representational democracy and all that. I mean, that is a certain vision of, and freedom itself as the good, you know. But then, if that is indeed a positive conception of the good life, we want to wonder, and what's the justification for it? And does that justification hold up as against alternative conceptions of the good life that you might get, for example, in Plato and Aristotle or in Leibniz or whoever it might be? Now, the question of which is more that could be said about all those, of course, but the monarchy. I mean, as I've been recently going back to some of these classical political texts from Plato and Aristotle, and also sort of the Abrahamic Platonists like St. Augustine and others, right? This idea of the kingdom of God, the kingship of God. What that means, at least on a certain reading, is that no man can be king over any other, because only God is king. And indeed, you find this in, for example, the book of Judges in the ancient Israelite polity, that one of the judges, Gideon, is offered the kingship. He says, I will not be king, nor will my sons be king over you, because God will be your king. Of course, eventually the people clamor enough for a king that King Saul is appointed, but it's a concession and to the desire of the Israelites to be like the other nations. But the ideal clearly there, and also I think in the Platonic ideal of the Golden Age, in the Statesman and Laws, for example, is that God directly is the shepherd, the divine king over humanity. But humanity lives as equals then, right? It's the perfect anti-tyrannical, anti-authoritarian view, because once again, no human being could be in that position of king over any other. So that at least is a kind of ideal, whether it's realizable without divine intervention. It's another important philosophical question, I think.
I'm trying to think here about the way in which this nihilistic liberal politics opens up from the perspective of a Platonic or an Aristotelian politics, and the way in which that void seemingly almost immediately gets filled by, you could say, Marxist politics. Like that the concern of Marxism and the concern of Marxist politics appears, it doesn't even take half a century really before like ideas of world communism as a sort of a telos for the whole thing becomes politically active in a serious way. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, how this seemingly nihilistic liberal political void of free market competition and individuals pursuing their own conception of the good that this seems also at the same time quite unstable, like that it's like a vacuum, or it opens a vacuum as a question
Hmm.
that, in and of itself doesn't seem to, um I want to say, doesn't in and of itself seem to have a sustainable existence.
Yes. So I think that, right, there's also, of course, the philosophical side of this political reality. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that sort of the furthest extreme of the anti-metaphysical thinking of the 19th, 20th century on both analytic and continental sides of the aisle terminates in a kind of political vision of democracy as uh, the absence of truth, the absence of the good. And I say with a capital T, with a capital G. So I'm thinking of Derrida, who's famously in like books like Rogues, he's got the idea of the democracy to come. Sort of what deconstruction licenses ultimately is this vision of a democracy that's never here but always deferred, and always sort of capable of undermining itself, because, as he says, democracy is the one form of government that has within it the power to undo itself. So you just vote in a tyrant. And I mean, that was what Plato already observed in the Republic, of course, that democracy has this tendency to shade itself into tyranny. And then Rorty, of course, on the analytic side, again, it's since we have no truth, since we all just start with our own basic vocabularies that are not philosophically demonstrable, but just a sort of pragmatic way of dealing with one another. Democracy is just that open space of contestation in which different pragmatic commitments sort of butt heads, and there's not a rational basis on which to say, well, this is what's actually true, or this is what's actually good. I mean, human thinking for him is not a mirror of nature. It can't glom on to what's true in itself or good in itself. So now, I mean, you see in some thinkers in the post-structuralist world, at least, dissatisfied with that. I mean, Badiou, for example, who wants to return to the idea of communism as a political truth function, right? Is that the events of communism inaugurate certain infinite truths into our world to which we can have fidelity as subjects of those events, and so on and so forth. And that's, I mean, as you were pointing out, hand in hand, yeah, Marxism more broadly. I mean, you get Zizek also in that sphere, returning to those sorts of thoughts. But now, the Platonist in me wonders whether that's sufficient to fill
Uh-huh.
that void. I mean, I maybe agree with
And
you that it's to
yep,
fill that void that those ideas are coming in,
right.
but then maybe it's just still more void. Ultimately, I mean, quite literally in the case of Badiou and Zizek.
Well, they
Whereas,
say sometimes that let's say that communism is itself a dream or a phantasm of capitalism.
hmm,
So that it itself could be a void object. Like, what is this communism that you're pointing toward? Like,
hmm, yeah, it's true that they do say that. I wonder what exactly the target of that criticism is, because sometimes Zizek, it seems to me, will say that about a certain communism, namely one that's just a fantasy of, now unrestricted production and productivity that's all rationally organized in accordance with the planned economy, etc. It says, well, okay, that's just wanting capitalism without the contradictions. But then I
I
still think he
think
does have a positive view of, the
well,
commons, as he often talks about it.
no,
Uh,
well, he says the commons is a problem, and now he more recently emphasizes war communism. So like it's a negative form of communism, like that communism will be necessary because of commons problems that we can't avoid. But he's against this like positivist notion of communism. But like there's two dreams, like I think, that is trying to avoid. One is, let's say, the dream of labor without capital. This would be what you're referencing with this like pure productivity. And then the other, which is more appearing in like Silicon Valley tech bros, which would be capital without labor.
hmm,
Like that AI eliminates the need for labor at all. We just have pure functioning of the capitalist machine.
hmm. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. But so I think, I guess the worry that I have here about Badiou and Zizek and so on is that is materialism a sufficient metaphysics for the politics that we might wants. Supposing, I mean, I'm not saying I agree with their politics either, but for the politics that would remedy what we take to be the ills of the present, you know. So Plato, I mean, going back to the Laws, which is his final and longest dialogue, in which Socrates doesn't appear, but it's just the Athenian stranger who is the Platonic mouthpiece. In Book 10, where he, in a way, inaugurates the very tradition of rational theology in the West through proofs that the gods exist, that they are concerned with human affairs, and that they can't be bribed, but practice pure justice or pure goodness. The part of the reason that he offers these proofs is because he's worried about the materialists of his day. I mean, he says, there are those who believe that stones and rocks and fire and water and earth and air are the fundamental bits of the universe, and that things like reason and soul and law, in particular, and the dialogue's called Law, is about law, are just conventions that sit on top of this basic metaphysical furniture of the universe, which is the material. And he says, if you have such a view, it actually will undermine the very possibility of pursuing the good in the political sphere, because it ends up, again, becoming the sophistical view that since laws are mere conventions, each one just asserts to be good what they take to be good, and it's just a conflict of forces and power or violence to determine who comes out on top. Whereas
That they're
Plato,
like kind of abyssal, and like they're abyssal in the sense that like what is the ground upon which they're posited.
exactly. And so then you need a Platonic metaphysics, according to Plato, no surprise, in which
He's a little biased, right?
it's the immaterial, exactly. It's the immaterial, and the good is the highest principle of the immaterial world. The idea of the good, the form of the good. In order to then, and the material world is secondary. It comes from, it sort of emanates out or is overflowed out from the good, and that then can secure, as it were, the laws of the city and of humanity as a whole, to can collectively pursue through the exercise of their own reason, the rational part of their souls, the good life for humanity, which turns out to be life under the kingship of the divine. And so without that, I guess, yeah, if it's just a void all the way down or negativity all the way down,
yeah.
then that's the worry.
So you use the word immaterial. You didn't use the word ideal. And I was wondering if we could unpack maybe how those terms function, because specifically, just for the viewers, in Badiou and Zizek's work, there's a distinction between democratic materialism and dialectical materialism. And the democratic materialism, as you already pointed towards, the democratic materialism is bodies and languages with no truth. The dialectical materialism is bodies, languages, but truth as well. Truth, let's say, in a Bedouin sense, as an event, which could be like this, I take it to be, could be in the dimension of the immaterial dimension of material, because it's like produced by material, but like the curvature of material, but it's not like an ideal, positively existing Platonic reality, let's say, in a traditional classical Platonic interpretation. So there is a way, at least I know in Zizek for sure, where there is sort of a staying with negativity, but that there's a truth there nevertheless in the, let's say, curvature of the space of materiality or something like that, where there's really material progress in a, not just in a reductive scientific sense, but in a emancipatory political sense.
Yes, that all sounds right to me as a description of their view.
Yeah.
And then the hard work would be to investigate, do the hard metaphysical labors. Like, will that do the trick? And does that view actually work out as they want it to? So it's true that, of course, they both want to be non-reductive materialists, certainly. So they're not, trying to reduce our subjectivity to brain states and do all that work, or bring everything back to the basic particle physics, and so as much as Zizek loves quantum physics as well. But they also,
this is the difference
Zizek
between like scientific materialism and dialectical materialism.
Exactly. And Zizek will say it's a materialism without matter. He also wants to say, because it's not materialism of like rocks and stones, it's absolute negativity, which is, more material. It's less than nothing. I mean, it's not even anything. It's just a minus
Well,
within
that's the
the
quantum
void.
field or whatever.
Yes, exactly. So it's true that then, it might look like this kinds of statements that Plato is making, for example, as I just recounted about the materials of his day. You say, well, okay, maybe that applies to, what I say, the democratic materialist, but not to this other kind of materialism. But I would say maybe yes, but maybe this other materialism can't quite get the goods either. That is, it's not sufficiently different in the final analysis from the materialism from which they want to distinguish themselves, which, I mean, is exactly the reason they want to draw those distinctions, because they recognize that, oh, this view is perhaps ever so close to being confused with the view that everyone knows can't be right, which is the materialist view that Plato's criticizing and so on. But again, I wonder whether Badiou and Zizek in this dialectical materialism can get us where we would want to go, and that desire of wanting is not arbitrary. I say, as reasoning beings, we're pursuing the final end of all things, which is the good. But I think both Badiou and Zizek sort of bottom out on a kind of arbitrary decisionism, if I may put it so strongly. That, I mean, for Badiou to decide upon a truth, that's the basic ground of our adherence, our fidelity to the events of, let's say, communism, political events of communism, decisions we make. Or for Zizek, it's the abyssal act. Now I wrote a whole PhD dissertation defending that view from an earlier period in my development. So I see the attractions of it. But then I also think, well, if there's no ultimate rational ground for, let's say, the new world, the new form of life we want to create, but it's just an abyssal act or undecidable decision, it leaves open both the best and the worst. And it doesn't provide us with the kind of blueprints, so to speak, of a new world. Now, granted, those folks are all suspicious of blueprints and recipes for the cookbooks of the future and all the rest. But without that, I think we're just, almost falling back to
Rudderless.
randomness. Sorry?
We're rudderless. I was
Rudderless.
because
That's
you were
right.
going because you were going like this. We've lost our rudder. We've lost our direction, and that is sort of not a straw man, because I often reference Alenka Zupancic's idea of the object disoriented ontology. So there's this way in which there is in Zizek and the Slovenian school, there is this fundamental disorientation, and of course that's also orbiting the object patia as this object of disorientation itself and object cause of desire. Now you keep referencing, and also say, like, as a sort of, an aside there, that these are the weeds, these are the deep, and Dylan is the one to help us along the way, because you did do your PhD working on clearly understanding what is the basic presuppositions of Badiou's work, what are the basic presuppositions of Zizek's work, right? So you've gone into the depths of these contemporary great philosophers, and now you're taking a reflective distance and taking a deeper reflective questioning about the foundations of philosophy itself. I remember when I got into Zizek, I was motivated by, he was questioning the basic presuppositions of Marxism, through the return to Hegel. And it's kind of like what you're doing is questioning the basic presuppositions of contemporary continental philosophy and saying, do we need to go back and look at the presuppositions of the Platonists and the presuppositions of the classical thinkers, and what do we find there? Why would we want to go back there? So you kept on saying, for example, does Badiou and Zizek's politics give us, quote unquote, the goods? Does it do the trick? You said, and I know someone like Zizek would say, on the level of desire, he would say, we don't know what we want. Right. So I guess my question would be, what are the goods? Tell us the goods. We need to know.
Yes,
what
and
is the trick that we want to perform? And what do we want here, Dylan?
It's beautiful, yeah. And I should say, just particularly about the rudderlessness as well, that it's the myth in Plato's Statesman is a famous myth in which the world, the whole cosmos, can rotate in two directions. So the old way, before our world that we know, there was the golden age of Chronos, where Kronos ruled humanity directly, or cared for humanity's divine shepherd, in which it was a time of universal justice, peace, harmony, and happiness. And I say those are the goods. But so he was ruling in his golden age, and then at a certain point, for reasons unknown, he let go of the world because he was guiding it with the steering oars, the divine steering oars. He let go of the world, and the world then flipped its rotation. It's sort of like Superman when he flies around the world the opposite direction to save Lois Lane in that famous film. And now the world is in the age of Zeus, and it's a gradual degradation from that golden age because we are without a paddle, without a rudder, without the divine oarsman, steersman, as Plato would say. And it's just at the point of near total destruction of the world that Kronos will return, take up the oars of the world again, and bring the world back into its proper rotation. And it's a future golden age that will come, in which that universal peace, happiness, harmony, and justice will return. Now, whether you take that literally, or whether you take it as Plato says in the Laws, it's a story to tell us the ideal of human political organization, that we ought to live in such a way that imitates that golden age of Kronos. And I mean, there it's quite remarkable. It says the ideal city is the one in which everything is held in common. This is why Badiou loves Plato. I mean, he's held in the first communist in a certain way, is everything is held in common. And we know from the Republic that the guardians hold everything in common. And it's a debate. I think Aristotle wonders whether it's just the guardians in the Republic or also the other two classes. But in the Laws, it seems to me he's saying quite directly that the ideal city is one which everything's held in common. Now, again, maybe it's only if God is your king that you can make that work, whereas the city that's described in the Laws is the second best city, which means it's governed by law, which in a way is a stand-in for God. So you don't have God ruling you directly. You need laws to constrain human beings. But anyway, so I want to get back to your question, which is, what are the goods? So, and it's a great way that you phrase it, or maybe I phrased it originally, because of course it's the good are the goods, right? The goods are ultimately the good. But it's all human beings. I mean, this is what both Plato and Aristotle think. All human beings desire what is good. And in fact, everything they do is for the sake of what is good. No one desires what is bad. You say to someone, hey, I can give you what's good or I give you what's bad. Which do you want? They say, well, of course I want what's good. But now the key is no one agrees about what is truly good. What does the good consist of? I mean, some will say the good is power. The good is wealth and fame or glory or physical pleasure, animal pleasure, sexual pleasure, what have you. And they pursue each of those things thinking that will satisfy me. That will bring happiness or eudaimonia, right? So the idea is everyone desires what is good, and they desire it because they take it that in achieving the good, they will achieve the good-spiritedness, which is almost what eudaimonia really means, literally, the fulfillment, the flourishing, the well-being of happiness. And again, everyone disagrees, of course, on what happiness is, what will bring us happiness. I mean, this is still a problem, of course, to the psychoanalytic period. It's a great topos of the psychoanalyst. It seems we can never be satisfied, isn't it the case? But indeed, I think both Plato and Aristotle, who, Hegel calls the teachers of the human race, that's why I keep on saying them together, Plato and Aristotle, both think that the only thing that satisfies is God. I mean, call it the absolute, the eternal, the divine, the infinite, what have you. But that's the thing that all human souls are yearning for, because it is the good and is happiness itself in a certain way. But of course, what does it mean to attain that good? It means to imitate the divine in our own lives by living lives of virtue. So it's a famous thesis from Plato and Aristotle that true happiness is the life of virtue, life guided by reason. And those virtues are imitations of divine virtue. It's like, just as God is just, perfectly just, so too we ought to be perfectly just. Just as God is perfectly wise, so too we ought to be as wise as we can be as human beings. And that will bring us happiness. But then, right, on the collective side, of the political side, again, it's to, as it were, bring the divine down into the human world, to bring heaven down to earth. And I think, or as I just discovered, it seems both Plato and Aristotle, and then also Augustine, as well, sort of in the Abrahamic tradition, think that the highest political ideal is peace. Because peace is as it were, the goodness of the divine brought into the collective of humanity, the human political collective. And that's the characteristic of the golden age, both past and future, for Plato, is universal peace among human beings. I mean, both inner peace as well. The highest spiritual attainment of the human beings is to achieve a kind of perfect inner peace, and then peace in the home, peace in the city, and peace among cities. So maybe that's in a way too determinative. But I think if I just say one more thing, I mean, the way to get all of that going, I think philosophically, because of course, that's got to be what gets us wherever we go. It's got to be the arguments, I think. It's a drive of reason, ultimately, I think, because I think humans are reasoning creatures. And so when we ask why backwards to the first cause of everything, it's because all human beings by nature desire to know, as Aristotle says in the opening sentence of Metaphysics. They desire to know, and to know something is to know its causes, and I think, to know the reasons. And we use our reason to find the reasons for things, and the ultimate reason must be that thing which is a reason for itself. And so too forwards, when we're looking for the good that we all pursue and all desire, which will give us happiness, it's also reason. It's saying, well, why? Why am I doing anything in my life? Why do I get up in the morning? For the sake of what? What do I? And often it's conditioned things. Like, well, I want to make money. I want to get some power. I want to get the pleasure of this or that kind. I say, well, but those are all means to some end. And what end are they means towards? And the human being needs to have some end, because as reasoning creatures, we desire to pursue something that will bring ultimate satisfaction. I think that's could only be, again, the good. Yeah.
There's definitely a way in which what I see as the unity between, let's just, for the sake of this conversation, and we'll say that for the sake of our investigations for the month in the portal, we can use figures like Badiou and Zizek and juxtapose them against figures like Plato and Aristotle, just as a helpful thinking through the differences between these basic orientations. And if I would to propose a unity between these thinkers, it would be on the level of the drive of reason. Like that, they all believe that, basically, as far as I'm aware. I know Zizek says that explicitly. He says something like the drive of reason is silent and indestructible. You can never get rid of it. It has to just keep, the cunning of reason here, like referencing Hegel, which of course is not like my individual reason, but some world spirit geist of reason. And also I think someone like Zizek, in a dialectical materialist way, is looking for the modern subject and struggling with the problem of the modern subject, and in terms of sacrificing for a cause, like a real cause, like a real telos or an end, like that does appear, in a, maybe not in the exact same way that Plato and Aristotle talk about it, but that's also there. I'm reminded that someone like Zizek also says in Hegel in A Wired Brain, I'm pretty sure he says something like, isn't there something that we feel intuitively when we read pre-modern metaphysics that we simply cannot think like that anymore? Like that, almost like he's suggesting a break as well, like a discontinuity. So I want a presence, like there is a continuity in a way with the drive of reason and sacrificing for a cause, but at the same time he's also playing around in a modernist break, and of course they will always, I think Badiou and Zizek alike, will reference American and French revolutions, something about modernity, something about liberal democracy, something about modern politics is something distinct and opening up something new, which the classics or the ancients couldn't think. Now, my presupposition would be the way you're talking about God and the good and peace and happiness, like specifically, like if God is infinitely just, we should strive to be infinitely just. My hypothesis would be that they would propose that to be something like an impossible object, like that like that's the subject getting hung up on the impossible object, or staying within the universe of desire, or something like that. I know, like, for example, the distinction that I would make in the course on the philosophy of right would be Kant proposes, for example, the eternal peace in a way, the peace between all nations, this is where the project was going. You know, Kant had a telos in a way about where all this was going with the nation state, that it was towards peace, universal peace. And Hegel basically just said that's impossible, war is imminent. Like, the states will always be in a kind of war and disequilibrium with each other and so forth. And Zizek certainly continues that, like saying basically communism will only appear through some sort of violent necessity. Like it will be, not this again, this not this positive object. So there's a lot there, but I'm basically trying to say, okay, there are grounds for a continuity here. There is some continuity, which perhaps means we're still in the universe of philosophy at all, right? With reason as still thinking in terms of reason, and still thinking in terms of causation, and even if it's maybe a different form of causation than in the classical world. But then there's also this radical discontinuity which is being proposed, and it seems to me like what we're going to be trying to work out in the portal is, okay, if is there this radical discontinuity? Is the modern break as radical as it appears, or are there still resources in the ancients that are just as applicable for our time as any other time? Is that what do you think of that?
Yes, I think that's spot on. And so I should say, I mean, to a few of the things you said, that right, it's true that, yeah, and the reason I love Badiou and Zizek and have been inspired by them to continue along their path of renewing philosophy of the absolute, renewing the absolute in our day in the wake of its, 200-year denial, is because, right, part of it is they want to return to Plato. I mean, Badiou especially, I mean, he wrote a whole hyper translation of Plato's Republic, in which he sort of made Socrates have his own views, but that's because he takes Plato to be this great teacher in a way that also, right, I mean, Hegel, closer to his time, both of them have been so maligned by the anti-metaphysical traditions of thought in the last recent centuries, that who better to look to as a way of rehabilitating the truth. But now, of course, for Badiou, it's not the Platonism of that day. It's a new Platonism of the multiples, he says. It's a Platonism without one, which means also without the good, because excuse me, the good and the one are two names for the same thing in the Platonic tradition. And so too with Zizek. I mean, Zizek, yeah, less than nothing, right? It begins with this whole thing on Plato's Parmenides, which was the great dialogue that the Neoplatonists also loved, but right, he has to interpret it in the dialectical materialist way that he does, which means, right, it's just supposed to be the contradictions are the truth, and the one, which is the subject of the Parmenides, the dialogue Parmenides, is, right, this impossible object, as you say. It's the one's already divided into two, and there's never the unity from which all things come. And so now I wonder, though, right? I mean, and this is the hard philosophical work, which hopefully we'll do. I think we try and do is
absolutely
are they right about that, or is right because they're, as you nicely put it, they have a sort of psychologistic story, maybe at least in Zizek's side, about the obsession with God amongst the more theologically minded philosophers. Well, it's this impossible object of desire that stands in for a sort of incompleteness in the unconscious or the psyche, or whatever it is. And I mean, it's a nice story. I want to say, couldn't I just flip that and say to Zizek, no, your negativity is itself merely a kind of philosophical expression of the void in your own soul, to put it pointedly enough, and for Badiou as well. I mean, there's a God-shaped hole in your heart, as people will say. So it's not that my metaphysics is an attempt to, fill a lack. Of course, it is doing that, but that's what metaphysics ought to do. I think is that yes, we do lack something as created finite beings, and what could, as it were, complete us, if not the infinite. But that's the positive story to tell on this account. It's not a psychologistic debunking of the story, but that's right. And I think, as you pointed out,
I think here I just want to bring up very quickly, I think it's really important, is because you're just emphasizing the psychologistic. I think as well as emphasizing this discontinuity, the discontinuity where Badiou and Zizek here are aligned is, I think both of them think no philosophy before psychoanalysis. They both think you have to go through psychoanalysis, right? Like I think Badiou says explicitly, for example, that any future philosopher will have to work through Lacan, for example.
Yes, that's right. And I guess, of course, they both sort of take that in different ways. For Badiou, it's because psychoanalysis is sort of the truth procedure of love, properly speaking. And so it's not philosophical as such, but philosophy has to gather the truths from that truth procedure. Whereas for Zizek, Lacan's anti-philosophy is actually philosophy. It's anti-philosophy in the sense that Hegel's Wissenschaft is not philosophy because it's consummated Sophia, it's wisdom itself. But I think, again, here's a nice way of tying into Plato what's psychoanalysis? Is the analysis of the psyche, of the soul. The psyche just is the Greek word for soul. And they're so close, of course, in terms of, thinking Freud and Plato, thinking about the soul as divided in itself, as being in conflict with itself, and as needing a kind of therapy, a kind of care of the soul through dialogue, mind you, through language, the logos, in order to, as it were, somehow remit or help the soul to escape from that conflict. Now, of course, you would say, well, it can never escape, or it's caught in endless negativity. It's the acceptance of that fact that brings a kind of reconciliation with the whole in the soul that each of us is. But in some way, right, the Platonic view that, well, we couldn't fill it, but the good could. When we welcome the light of the good, which comes from a sort of radical outside of the soul, it can, as it were, illuminate our own minds in a new way. That's right. And I'll just say one thing about the modern world. This is a critique, I suppose, or objection when I speak to folks maybe about this incipient project. They say, well, so you just want to return to the ancients and you don't think there's anything of value in modernity? As I said, well, no, that can't be. Or that you disbelieve, Dylan, the Hegelian story, let's say, about the fundamental importance of the modern breakthrough, which one way of putting that breakthrough is it's a breakthrough of freedom. And that's certainly how both Kant in his Copernican revolution, then also, of course, in the political revolutions of the day, American French Revolution, and then Hegel in his own way will understand those breakthroughs of freedom. So well, now freedom becomes the absolute, the ultimate. And now we moderns can't but believe, in a sense, that freedom is supreme. But I here's just a little toy argument for why it couldn't be right.
You want a revolution of slavery, Dylan.
Is the absolute. No, is that freedom is a means to an end. Maybe it's a necessary means, but it's a means to an end. Because I think we believe, don't we, that freedom is good.
It's not an end in itself.
Right. Because freedom is good for those who are good, and it's bad for the bad. And we believe this, I suppose, in our everyday practice. We think with those who are doing bad things like murdering people and all this should have their freedom constrained, perhaps temporarily, but so that they don't go around doing those bad things. Now, it's bad, right, for the people to whom those things are done. Let's say the victims of violence and so on. But it's also bad, and even primarily so, for the one who does them. Because on the Platonic view, as you commit these evil acts, you corrupt your soul ever further, so that it's to your benefit that you're prevented from continuing to perpetrate evil until such time as perhaps your soul has become good, and then you're able to do good. Whereas again, freedom is good for the good, because those who are good use freedom to increase and elevate and deepen the goodness of themselves and of the world. Now, what I mean with all that is, again, the final end towards which all things strive, and that which is an end in itself, is the good. Freedom is, you can use freedom for good or for evil, I guess is what I mean to say. So then, just as you can use wealth for good and evil, you could use power for good and evil, you could use fame and glory for good or for evil. This is sort of a classic Platonic point. So all of those are external goods in the sense that they're not ends themselves, but means to other ends, which again, you could go either way with it. Whereas, what's that thing that can only be used for good? The good. You can't use the good for evil. It's just not possible. And evil, as well, is the only thing that's bad in itself. It's almost a tautology, but then philosophy is ever so close to always just being a series of tautologies.
All right. So first, I want to start by saying I feel like this is a lot of fun playing in these cracks, but sort of engaging with these cracks, I want to sort of also remind the listener that this is sort of a teaser or a taster for the types of things we're going to explore in greater detail in the portal. So let me play with you a little bit on the distinctions you were bringing up. So in regards to the endless negativity thing, I think that Hegel's logic is basically saying that the trick that the modern subject needs to be enculturated into is that the negative is positive. So it's just kind of this perspective shift on the negative. So there is a way in which Hegel is tempting us or almost trying to structure us to be able to handle that truth. I think that the negative is positive, and that spontaneously, I think Hegel would say, ordinary consciousness can't help but think about the negative as negative. That it's entirely counterintuitive to see the negative as positive. The other point I wanted to throw out was about the nature of freedom and the good, where I think in the philosophy of right, Hegel would say, world spirit is absolutely free, whether or not we're good or bad. And whether or not we're good and bad would depend on how we self-limit ourselves. So it's about our own capacity for limitation. In a way, it's our own capacity for self-responsibility and absolute freedom. But that whether or not we posit the good as good, I think Hegel would say world spirit is absolutely free. And I think he would point towards the battle of the states as and almost the horror of what states can do as proof of that. Like, for example, we could think about atomic weaponry and like, will we drop a bomb on Iran or Israel, or are we going to nuke each other? Like, this is kind of like the horror of our freedom in a way, so I don't think he's, and this is a sort of shock to, let's say, classical sensibilities of the good in a deep way. And then finally, the thing I'll say, and this is, I think, the point of the logic for the global brain, is I think Hegel would say something like the one as the good would be like a pure being that becomes nothing. And then the opposite would be when we posit there's no good and it's just pure nothing, then that instantly becomes being. So that you have this vanishing of the one into the nothing and the nothing into the one. And then you get this mutual vanishing that we have to, in a way, tarry with.
Yes, that strikes me as right about Hegel. And so and it's a good, I think, antidote to, of course, the simplistic readings of Hegel that just seems to be completely wrong-headed, that he's the thinker of the end of history where everything comes together in a beautiful harmony and the rational state and all that. We just know they can't be right for exactly the reason you say, which is that the philosophy of right ends with world history, which, as you point out, is the ultimate antithesis to the view of a final harmony of humanity, because it's a vision of perpetual war, not a vision of perpetual peace. And that's the ultimate stage of human freedom. It's, so far as philosophy of right is an account of freedom, at least objective freedom and objective spirit, and it's the world's historical individual who sort of leads people into battle, and if the world spirit has the ultimate right, it's the absolute right, is the right of the world spirit, meaning it's the right of world history. So, I mean, because often when I say, okay, we need the good, and they'll say, but Hegel calls ethical life the living good.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's because each form of life, in a way, is some good being posited by some finite group of people, and they live in accordance with that vision of what they take to be good. But then Hegel's point is none of those visions of the good are absolute, because each one just comes to be and passes away on the stage of history. And what settles what the next one will be? It's, the violence and power of which state can win the war against the other. But so as much as Hegel wants to, of course, rehabilitate the absolute, recover the absolute in the wake of Kant's denial, the absolute that he gets, I think, at the end is this sort of absolutization of well, of course, of war, but that just means of negativity itself, right? Is that nothing is stable, nothing is lasting, everything undoes itself, falls away, and so on. And that's, it's liberating thought to the degree that we think that our current world can or should fall away. I mean, that's what Zizek would do. So it's to say the way things are isn't the way things must be forever, and indeed they can't be because they're always shot through with negativity. So something new can and will come, whether it's good or bad. We don't can't say. But now I want to say, okay, you have this whole space of contestation and negativity, perpetual war. Is that all that the life of the spirit can offer us? And I use that term not just in the Hegelian sense, but also maybe in a different sense. Or is there a sort of almost a transcendent point above the fray, which is the standpoint of the good, which demands peace and the pursuit of peace? I mean, Plato makes this argument at the beginning of the Laws. He says, war can't be an end in itself. Though that's what his interlocutor, the Spartan, who he's speaking with, right? The people of Sparta thought that the point of the state is to just win war and to be the best at war. And so everyone had to be trained. They were, as soldiers, they ate communal meals as if they were always on the battlefield, because that was the whole point of political life. But he says war itself is a means to an end. And this is sort of the same argument that I've been giving over and over again. It's a means to an end, the end of peace. Otherwise, it's unintelligible in itself, just conflict for the sake of conflict. That itself is just incoherent or irrational, because there's no reason for that conflict outside of itself. That is something that could be something to be pursued for its own sake, which again, I'm claiming is peace. So that would be the sort of what I'm thinking of as a kind of antidote, if it were, or maybe a sublation of the Hegelian view of perpetual negativity, perpetual war.
Sure.
So there you go.
I think the thought experiment that I always try to run with this is, say perpetual peace were achieved. Like it would be like it, and I'm not saying, like, I obviously have no idea, right? Like I have no idea. I don't know if that's possible. But let's say it is. Like it's just, if the one were, like, I guess that's the thought experiment I always ran. If the one were, like the one in the way you're talking about it, if the one were present, I can't help but think that the subject would be absent. What do you like? That's what I've always like. I've always just run that thought experiment. Like, so I guess it would be like, I agree with you that war for its own sake, in many ways doesn't make sense, and that war is a means towards an end, which is peace. And I guess that would be the human way of conceiving it. But I think from the standpoint of the absolute, again, there's this logic that negativity is positive, almost so that we can set up this weird dialectical trap where we have to, again, fight for peace. Because if the one were, then again, we wouldn't be. So it's, again, I think this, and this is, I think, the zero level of Zizek's philosophy, which is, the zero level is a philosophy that is trying to think the nature of the subject as not this rational egotism or liberal free market capitalist, but as almost like this monstrous death drive of sorts.
Yeah, well, I think that is the right challenge, to raise against.
We've got the challenge. We've got the challenge.
And the question will be, I mean, so there's this, what is it, the Talking Heads, the song, "Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens." It's this line.
Exactly.
Because we think that, right, that's the achievements of the one, or the good, the realization.
Yeah.
Well, it's just pure stasis, sort of, it's the cherubs singing in the clouds. And where's the subject of freedom, the negativity that keeps them going? I would say, well, right, there's two sort of tracks I take. One is to say, well, I mean, you mentioned Kant and perpetual peace. I mean, in a way, Kant is agrees with Hegel that there's perpetual war, because perpetual peace is an infinite goal in his mind, meaning it can never be achieved. So he believes that actually the condition of humanity is one of perpetual war. Now, that could be to his credit if we think Hegel's got on the right track, and so Kant is actually quite a bit much more like Hegel. Hegel just makes it explicit in a way that Kant didn't. But I also wonder, right? So that's one track to take. Another is to say, well, the true name for this view of mine is not just going up to heaven. It's bringing heaven down to earth, right? So it's not. I mean, the idea that souls are in a disembodied state, devoid of materiality. In fact, it's that form and matter, soul and body, are meant for each other and should be together. And so, in a way, it has to be an earthly and fleshly ideal in some respect. But in a way, it's a divinization of the the fleshly and the material, which I must admit, I still have to work out and think through exactly what that means. But I think perhaps there's a path forward there of being able to keep, on the one hand, some of the desiderata, so to speak, of the materialist view, which is that matter shouldn't be discarded in the name of some purely immaterial existence, which indeed may be liable to the kind of objection that you raise, which is that, yeah, if you just fly away from the body, from the material world, from the negativity of our embodied life, you end up in a kind of pure stasis, eternal, unchanging existence, which is not genuinely human or something like that. But if there's a way of actually bringing heaven down to earth instead, and there's still infinite tasks for us, even when we've achieved perpetual peace, for example, at the theoretical level. The wisdom of the divine is infinite, and we will always have more to learn and understand, even if our material needs are met. I mean, there's a kind of Adornian thought there as well, right? It's only once our material needs are met that the absolute spirit can do its work.
Well, that would certainly be the Marxist view as well, I suppose. Also Adorno. Then, so you have that side of the equation, and that is relevant. We're teaching the early Marx this year at Philosophy Portal, and last night I was actually watching a Joe Rogan podcast with Bernie Sanders, and they were actually talking about, like they were going on to deep metaphysical questions related to labor and AI. And they were saying, like, okay, once we have, Joe Rogan's of the belief that, once we have the AI set up and basically automating all of the factories, and then you have this challenge of, well, the human has been, getting purpose and virtue and living the good life in relationship to labor and work. And what do we do in a world where you have to institute something like a basic income? What are humans doing in a post-labor economy or a post-work economy, for example? And then you again, I think you get the revenge of philosophy or the return of metaphysics or the resurrection of metaphysics, where you have this question of purpose and virtue and beauty and cultivating that among humans. So just saying, like, that these conversations we're going to be having and these topics we're going to be exploring, I think we should connect them to, actual historical processes and some of the things that, they're not as abstract as you might think, right? Like they could become things that are major civilizational concerns in the 21st century.
And philosophy wouldn't be worth a damn if it didn't have something to say about
Right.
all of that. In fact, that's the end towards which I think all the philosophizing is in a way directed. And, I was just thinking, because Adorno says, it's on this idea of the resurrection of the flesh that materialism comes to agree with theology, he says, in Negative Dialectics. And he takes that to be, I guess, a point in favor of materialism. Whereas I guess my idea is it's a point in favor of theology, and we should follow that route out.
But you're resisting idealism.
Hmm.
You're resisting the word idealism, like as if theology was the antithesis of materialism, whereas there are materialist theologies.
I suppose that's true. And no, I suppose it's just been contingent that I haven't used the word idealism. I do think it is.
I mean, just for clarification, what's your take on the concept of idealism? Is it part of this metaphysics resurrected, or is it something that you also sort of hesitate to rehabilitate?
No, I think that is the word that could be used to describe I mean,
Okay.
Plato is often, yeah, said. I mean, it's there's sort of Platonic idealism. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
idealism meaning that the fundamental metaphysical ground of all things are ideas
yeah,
and
yeah,
not matter. And by
yeah,
ideas, of course, for Plato, we don't mean just the ideas that you or I happen to think, but ideas are themselves metaphysical entities or
yeah,
substances, eternal, unchanging. Maybe they're all ideas in the mind of God, as the later Platonists and Abrahamic Platonists will understand it to be. And I think right down to Hegel and Schelling, absolute idealism. I mean, in a way, that's just a making explicit, I think, or making good on certain commitments from the tradition, which again is counterposed to a merely subjective idealism as they attribute to Kant and Fichte, that it's everything's just in my head or in our
yeah, yeah,
heads. It's no, it's that what's absolute is sort of the structures of ideas in the world themselves. In the absolute itself is a kind of self-thinking idea that generates the world, material things, and all the rest. So uh, that's I'm happy. I'm happy to be an idealist. I think that's one way of understanding the, as it were, mainstream Platonic metaphysical through line from, yeah, Plato to Leibniz, and then right Hegel and Schelling, and we've seen a decline of idealism, haven't we? I mean, that's another way, decline of metaphysics
yep.
in 19th, 20th century. You know, say that's part of the mystical obscurantism of the metaphysical tradition. So they thought, and we got to be, you know, clear-minded, sober materialists who aren't flying off into the clouds of heavenly forms and all the rest. But maybe that's
Well,
where we need to be.
I'm gonna propose another sort of meta tension that we might want to unpack, which is that I was playing with the idea throughout our conversation that Badiou and Zizek are in a way already metaphysics resurrected, in the sense that they are considering the absolute. They are Platonists in a way, but where they kind of perhaps reach a real distinction with what you've been saying is they think the real battleground of philosophy is between democratic and dialectical materialism, and they kind of think like the whole conversation about materialism and idealism is in a way over with. So what I'm trying to say is the way we might want to position metaphysics resurrected is actually this question of idealism in the tension between democratic and dialectical materialism.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, I mean, the trouble, of course, or the complication, not which will be interesting to dig into, is that, of course, uh, Zizek wants to be Hegelian. Hegel
Yeah.
thinks philosophy must be idealism. So then, I mean, part of the great provocation of Zizek's work, of course, to say, Hegel's actually the basis for a new materialism. You think, what? What could be less plausible than that? But then, of course, he said, well, it's a materialism without matter. It's a materialism of absolute negativity itself. So, in a way, it is idealism understood in a certain way, but it's also materialism. And Badiou as well. I mean, Frank Ruda has this great book called For Badiou, Idealism Without Idealism, I believe is the title. So it's similar to Zizek saying it's materialism without matter. You know, Badiou's an idealist in a certain way because he believes in truth with a capital T and the absolute and all this. But it's an idealism without idealism in the sense that there's not some further realm of ideas beyond the material world. It's rather ideas or truths are a kind of immanent exception that breaks through into the bodies and languages of materiality with truths, you know. But I suppose, right, as I was saying with respect to Plato, the gambit I'd like to try out is to say, yes, idealism, but real idealism, and not idealism without idealism, or an idealism that's really materialism at the end of the day. I say, what if we tried to do, you know, Platonic idealism or Leibnizian or Schellingian idealism for real today, you know?
Well, the month in the portal is again going to be, let's say, titled Philosophy of Theology, but the main theme going to be Metaphysics Resurrected. We're going to be starting our month with a session explicitly called Metaphysics Resurrected. Our second event will be on post-Kantian speculative theology. The third event will be on theopolitics and the mystery of the kingdom. And then the final event, which will be a sharing circle, will be on mystical reason and rational mysticism. So, with those four events in mind, could you walk anyone who's considering getting involved through what you hope this series will be engaging or working with.
Yes. So I suppose the way I've been thinking about it is, the first session, Metaphysics Resurrected, is a sort of an introduction to metaphysics, also a journey through the history of metaphysics from Plato through to Leibniz. And then the critique of metaphysics in the name of pure reason that comes with Kant, 19th, 20th century critique of metaphysics, up to this question mark of today. Could metaphysics be resurrected, renewed, reborn? And then the second session, post-Kantian speculative theology, sort of now taking up this question mark and thinking through some of the more cutting-edge developments in philosophy in the last few decades, both on the side of the speculative turn, which we've been talking quite a bit about today with Badiou and Zizek and Meillassoux. And then also there's this other side, the theological turn, which we haven't talked about today, but we'll talk about then, Jean-Luc Marion and others. And then speculative theology, another name for metaphysics itself in the tradition, is sort of unification of speculative turn, theological turn. Theopolitics and the mystery of the kingdom. Well, I guess that's following through the ethical, political, or practical consequences of a resurrection of metaphysics and speculative theologies. We were talking about today things like heaven on earth, the kingship of God, perpetual peace, and the criticism or alternatives or objections to those views that may be raised historically or by contemporary thinkers. And then finally, mystical rationalism, rationalist mysticism. I mean, there's a worry, of course, about metaphysics from its opponents. Sometimes its opponents who are quite happy to endorse notions of God or the divine, but they say, well, the divine or God can't be reached by pure reason, as metaphysics claim, but instead you just have to sort of directly experience it, intuit it. It's ineffable ultimately, so it can't be expressed, but you just sort of become one with one through a mystical experience. And I want to say, well, in fact, rationalism or rational systematic philosophy is not opposed to that mystical notion, but the mystical experience can both be a spur to philosophize, encounter the divine. Now we want to understand what we've encountered, but also rational philosophy of metaphysics terminates at a certain point above which there are certainly all sorts of ineffable mystical states that don't get comprehended through systematic philosophizing. And that's sort of the payoff in some way of the philosophical journey. So just in general, I'd say philosophy for me is always a creature of the between. We're between heaven and earth, between the beginning and the end of all things, between the first mystical encounter of wonder and then that final wonder and mystical encounter, which issues from the philosopher's journey. And that's where we are, between.
Well, Dylan, I'm looking forward to the month. And for everyone who wants to get involved, there'll be a link in the description. You can get involved through joining the portal, of course, as a member. You can also join as well as you get access to the philosophy of theology that Dylan just went over here throughout August. Again, links in the description to all of that can be found below this video. Well, Dylan, I'm looking forward to working with you in the portal, and this conversation between contemporary continental philosophy and ancient classical philosophy, I think, provides us with endlessly fascinating material to work through, and I'll give you the last word.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you today, and I can't wait to talk with the wider community in August. It's going to be a great set of sessions, so I'm looking forward to that.
This August, we will be hosting philosopher Dylan Shaul, whose work orbits both the study of German idealism and the philosophy of religion. This month will function as an invitation to rethinking metaphysics with ancient, modern, and postmodern philosophy. To get involved during our live sessions this August, or to access the recordings indefinitely, sign up below.